Yeah, sure.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this plenary lecture by Professor Jack Grieve. Jack is Professor of Corpus Linguistics at the University of Birmingham, and his main research interests are, in addition to corpus linguistics, in sociolinguistics, notably computational sociolinguistics and dialectology. He's especially interested in grammatical and lexical variation in English across time, space, and various communicative contexts. He has developed methods for quantitative linguistic analysis of large electronic corpora and databases, online data, and he's also interested in authorship attribution and forensic linguistics. Now, where does Jack come from? He actually comes a long way. He comes from Vancouver, and he studied at Simon Fraser University for his BA and MA, and handed in his doctoral dissertation at Northern Arizona University under the supervision of Doug Biber. He then held postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Leuven and a lectureship in forensic linguistics at Aston University before landing in at Birmingham in 2017. So it goes without saying that Jack is a very experienced teacher and lecturer, supervisor. He supervised PhD students working on a range of topics, including corpus linguistics, dialectology, forensic linguistics, and sociolinguistics. If we look at his publication record, it is impressive, to say the least. His book on regional variation in written American English newspaper editorials came out at Cambridge University Press in 2016, and it was already in this book where we could see what was so characteristic about Jack and his work. He's not afraid of tackling topics and topic areas that most people consider all too difficult to tackle or handle. Studying regional variation in written language was one of those areas at that time. Then, subsequently, another area where Jack has excelled is the very topic area of our summer school, the study of online English data. In this vein, Jack's article on understanding US regional linguistic variation with Twitter data came out in 2016, and it was followed by a stream of articles within this research line, among them those based on the study of lexical innovation in American and British social media. Jack has also studied a wide range of topics. Just some of them I could name here: Donald Trump's tweets, large-scale patterns of number use in spoken and written English, the semantic, sociolinguistic origins of double modals in American English, and so forth. His latest book that came out last year is on the language of fake news, and it came out in the Elements in Forensic Linguistics at Cambridge University Press series. So that is also the topic of his plenary today. So let's all welcome Jack with a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Maria. I really appreciate that. Actually, maybe building on Miko's start the other day about sort of getting into linguistics. Mary has been too humble because my first book was published by Mary, and it wasn't an easy thing to publish, but you really stuck up for me. I actually happened here in Freiburg. I was here about 12 years ago, and well, no, you weren't here, but the reviewer was here, and the reviewer told me that the book had been rejected, and that was that, and I then went to Mary, and she sorted it out. And so I'm not sure I would have been here without Freiburg having to be here, and without Mary supporting me all those years ago. So those little things early on matter, right? And kind of picking up a head of steam, often with help of other academics, and maybe despite other academics as well. So that was really appreciated. Thank you. That was nice. Okay, so today I want to talk about the language of fake news. And I'm going to do sort of two studies here. So I am going to go through the book first and talk about those results, and then I'm going to present results that we've just have been defended recently by a PhD student of Matteo and Fuoli and I, named Bashar Baisa. This is just a defense that just happened a few months ago with Maite Taboada as the external, and she did very well and passed, and she just had her first paper accepted the other day in Discourse in Society. Although I won't focus on that data, I'm going to focus on one of her case studies and try to draw a comparison. Right, so this is going to pick up some of the different work we've been doing at Birmingham with Matteo and I and our PhD students who have been working on this topic. And I'll start with the book, and then I'll move on to this more recent study and kind of contrast the two. And the kind of broader thing I'm really interested in is how the communicative intent, like how the intent of a journalist, what their goal is for writing news, how that then causes variation in the linguistic structure of that news. And crucially then how different motivations for writing fake news then manifest themselves in variation in language structure, okay? And more generally, I kind of want to circle back to this at the end and bring it up a few times as we go. I'm interested in the nature of explanation in corpus linguistics and how it's really important to get explanations and what these explanations look like when you're doing not even large scale in this case, it's quite small scale data, at least the book, but when you're doing observational linguistics and how you create explanations, where they come from and how important they are. Okay, so here's an outline of the talk today. So I'm going to try to move through quite a bit of stuff. I'm going to start with a taxonomy of fake news, which is presented in the book. But what we'll see is that Bashar's study sort of challenges that in some interesting ways, or expands it a bit. Okay, so I think it's really important to know that, in general, we lack a really clear and consistent definition of fake news. And this is often presented as a real problem, and it's been presented sometimes as a reason not to study fake news, that we should be talking about other things, or that this is too kind of messy of a topic. But, in my mind, this is just a real world problem. And at least if we're applied linguists, to the extent we're applied linguists, we don't really get to pick what problems exist and what problems society cares about. And we should be willing to jump in and try to inform them, at least so far as they're linguistic problems, right? And so I think that's just an important thing to remember, that, fake news is a really complex thing. You'll find very many different definitions. Obviously, huge amounts of debates in politics and the media are what was fake, and people disagree on what is fake, okay? But there's also a real disagreement on what constitutes fake news, and then how we should study fake news. And my own personal view is that that's just the reality of the situation, right? Fake news is a thing you'll hear about all the time, right? You'll hear about it constantly in the media and in politics, and it's something that I think linguists can talk a lot about, right? Because we study language, and it's the language of fake news. But I think that also means we have to be really careful to define that concept, not to say this is what fake news is, but to define what we are going to look at when we're doing a study. And there's lots of different studies that you can do that have different definitions of fake news, or different distinctions between real and fake news. And, that's what you expect with these complex societal problems. But I do think it's really important then that we are really explicit when we do an individual study or build a corpus to analyze fake news, that we know in what sense it's fake, in what sense the comparison data is real, and to make sure that these things are comparable and that we can actually figure something out meaningful from it. Again, I'm going to keep coming back to this idea that in a corpus, you can find all sorts of patterns, right? There's always patterns in a corpus. You get enough data, you can find things, okay? But it's the explanation and understanding what's driving those patterns that makes them valid. And it's kind of just a logical argument at that stage. So what I'm going to start with then is this taxonomy of fake news that underlies the first study, and I think generally useful, although like I say, it can be expanded a bit, but it's based on these two ideas of veracity and honesty, and these are two things that are often conflated, but I think they're distinct, and it's important to try to see that. So I think most commonly what you find in fake news research, at least sort of tacitly, is this idea that fake news is distinguished from real news by veracity, right? So real news is true and fake news is false, right? And that's, I think, often the definition that you'll find. It's maybe the first one that comes to mind for most people. And that's a fine definition, I guess. It's quite simple, okay? Like on the surface, it's obviously not simple, really, because trying to figure out like truth is what like we all do for a living, and people have been doing it for a long time, and we don't agree on it yet, okay? But in a news context, it leads to a pretty easy way, or at least a way that feels easy to operationalize this, and that you use fact checkers, right? So you get data that fact checks as true and data that fact checks as false, and then you see if you can find linguistic differences between those. And the application, right, I guess, there's lots of possible applications, but the most obvious one is as the basis of tools for automatically or semi-automatically or even manually identifying fake news, right? And, so I'm thinking here like big natural language processing tools that are classifying things as fake news. This is often the approach taken. You get fact-check data, you train a system to classify data that fact-checks true from data that fact-checks false, okay? Another way of defining fake news, which seems similar at first, but, I'm going to argue that they're actually sort of distinct concepts here, is honesty, okay? And the idea here is that fake news is dishonest and real news is honest. So real news is intended to inform, like, when you give a legitimate journalist who's saying something they believe is true, they're telling it to you to inform you about the situation. That's kind of what journalism's supposed to be. I mean, outside of like op-eds, but, reportage. And fake news is intended to deceive, right? So fake news, if you're thinking like, say, about like, I don't know, government planted propaganda or something like that, these would be lies that are there to trick people, to get people to do something that isn't what you do if you knew the truth, okay? So this is this alternative view of what fake news is that you have honest and dishonest news, and real news is honest, and fake news is dishonest, okay? It's a much more challenging, at least superficially, I think just in general actually, much more challenging thing to operationalize because you're trying to get to like the author's intent. And generally, you can't do that, right? Like, it's really hard to get to the author's intent, especially when the author might be a liar, because then you have to trust that they're telling you their intent too or something, right? Like, it's a tricky situation. But I think it's an important distinction to make, and even if it's hard to get data, it's, something to keep in mind. And crucially, I think these two things are independent from each other, okay? So falsehoods are not necessarily shared with the intent to deceive, okay? Like, I don't doubt in this talk that I'll say something that, if I keep working on fake news, that 2-3 years from now I will disagree with. In fact, I'm telling you stuff here that that I've said in the book that I disagree with in light of Bashire's work. And so, I'm not lying. I'm giving you something that might be false, that might turn out to be false, but it's not a lie. I'm not trying to deceive you. I'm just telling you what I think is true, right? I'm trying to inform you, but I'm wrong about it being true. This happens in news all the time. If you look at any newspaper, open it up, there'll be all sorts of retractions and corrections, okay? It's not a big deal. It's a big deal if a newspaper does it too much. They monitor these things, but there's not considered, evidence of lying, right? Because it's not. It's just maybe you got information from your source that was wrong. Maybe, something that turns out to be false. And there's lots of examples. I'll come back to some examples later on from the corpus. And then similarly, and this is probably less obvious, but truths are not necessarily shared to inform. So things that are true are sometimes given, with the intent to deceive people. The most obvious one is what you might call fake news by omission, right? So it's when you present everything's true, but you leave out the important part, right? And we do this all the time, not just in news, but happens all the time, right? And so in that case, there's not a single falsehood in the thing you've said, but, there's a falsehood implied. It's the truth that you left out. But, the other thing that happens, right, is that people inadvertently tell the truth when they're intending to lie. And this can happen too, right? So someone's trying to deceive you. They believe what they're telling you is untrue, and they're doing it with the motivation to deceive you. They don't have intent to inform you, but they happen to be right. And this happens also, right? Happens in news too. Okay, so I think that if you've given this kind of these two variables, and you see them as both being kind of binary, then it then creates kind of a system where you have 4 different types of news. Real news, which in this kind of taxonomy would be true and intended to be true, and then these other combinations of these two variables, okay? So we get these 3 types of fake news. And I think it's important when you're studying fake news to understand where you sit in this taxonomy and what the implications of that. And it's not to say there aren't other relevant dimensions. I'm going to argue for another one later on. And, we probably don't leave that door wide open in the book. We probably should have left it a bit more open because, we have some interesting results now that kind of expand that a bit. But here's the taxonomy, okay? And so the idea is on the top row you have whether it's true or false. So the top row is true, the bottom row is false, veracity, like actual in the real world. And then honest and dishonest news, okay? And so you get things like retractions, which are errors, which are false, but they weren't done on purpose. They're trying to inform to the best of their ability, right? You got like a fake, you have a bad source who tricked you. You make an error, right? You write down 1,000 when you meant 10,000, okay? On the other hand, what we have is, I think, what we really mostly are interested in, or that society is mostly interested, which is things that are false and were meant to be false, right? That we're actively trying to deceive you. This seems like the thing we're most worried about. Certainly newspapers take this way more seriously, right? Like a newspaper will fire a journalist for doing type 2. They don't fire journalists for doing type 1 unless it's repetitive, in which case it's seen as careless, not purposeful. And then the last one is this one where everything's true, but it's dishonest. It had dishonest motives. They weren't trying to fully inform you of the situation. They were actually trying to keep some information back, okay? And we might be able to think of examples of that recently. Okay, so what I now want to move on to is the case study that we did, and the idea here is we're really going to focus in on real news and purposeful deception, okay? Where the author knew and purposely was giving false information, okay? It wasn't in this case false information to try to manipulate financial markets or create, political change, but it was purposely deceptive. They knew it was deceptive, and it was economic in this case. So this is Jason Blair. This was a really well-known case in the early 2000s. He worked at the New York Times, and he was accused of deliberately plagiarizing and fabricating articles. The New York Times, the way this came up was there was lots of building suspicion, but at one point he was reporting on a family of a soldier who was missing in action in Iraq from San Antonio, and he wrote a paper about how he went, an article about how he went in and interviewed the family in their home and described the interior of their home, and he had both made this up and plagiarized it from another reporter from the San Antonio newspaper. The reporter, I think what happened was the soldier was found dead, so she goes back to follow up on the study, on the article, and there's a guy from the Washington Post there in the New York Times, sort of arch enemy, and she mentions to him, it looks a lot similar to Jason Blair's article, looks a lot like mine, and the Washington Post got on it, right, because it's their kind of arch nemesis, and they blew up the story and then pushed it so that it led to this full investigation, and then ultimately to Jason Blair being fired, and to then admitting and to writing a book about it. And so it's a unique situation where the author admitted to it, where a full investigation was done by the newspaper, and where we have the full timeline of which ones were real and which ones were fake, and that they were all published intervening times. So it's a really fairly tight study in this case, that it's almost like a natural experiment. So that's what they did. They took from this period from just about 6 months, October 2002, April 2003. There's also data from before then, but it was never properly validated. So we just look at this. We pulled out all these articles. They're all marked with a correction. Okay, so basically some of these articles are marked with a correction, and some of them aren't. So the ones that aren't from within this period we keep as real news, and the ones that are marked with a correction are fake news. And we kept the ones that were at least 300 words long. Okay, they're all single-authored. And so what it contains in the end is 36 retracted, so type 2 fake news, where Jason Blair was making up the story, doing it not to try to manipulate people per se, but just doing it so he could write more articles and move up through the New York Times' very competitive newsroom, which was hyper-competitive at this time, notoriously competitive. They have just started a new program where the idea was to flood the scene or something, which meant you'd stick many reporters at a single, like New York Times would put many of their own reporters covering the same topic and then have them compete with each other to get the coverage, right? And so it was a hyper-competitive newsroom, and this led to Jason Blair, who, had been lying all the time. Like, he didn't even have his degree, for example. He had lied about that, lied about all sorts of things, lied that his cousin had died in 9/11. He was just lying all over the place. But this, this then gave someone like that a way of moving up through the system, which was to write as quickly as possible. Also, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of worry about kind of the rise of online news taking over from things like New York Times and stuff. But, he was using this. So he was using these like databases of news that were just becoming available, but yet probably most people weren't working with, and using that as a way to plagiarize. So this is the corpus. It's not a very big period. It's not a very big corpus. It's only about 55,000 words, and it's just a handful of articles. Here's the timeline of the data, and what I want to show here is a few different things. So the fake news is in pink, and the real news is in blue. And you can see that he wrote on various different topics, but two big ones were the DC sniper. When you might remember, there was people driving around Washington, D.C., and there was people getting sniped on the road, like there was a sniper. And it turned out to be a man and a kid, not a father and son, but they were sort of training the kid. It was an awful story, but that's sort of where Jason Blair was from, so they sent him down to cover the case. And then at some point he starts writing these war stories, which are, it's all about the Iraq War, but he's not in Iraq. He's going around to people's families that are missing, okay, and making it up. In that case, all the war stories are false, but otherwise, I think crucially on the sniper, you can see that there's a mixture, and that he's literally writing them on the same day. And in fact, you'll see that when he publishes two articles on the same day, almost always the second one's false. Like, he's just pushing, right? Just trying to make as much as he could. Okay. The analysis I'm going to show you is based on the full data set, but in the book, we also do the analysis just on the sniper data, just to show that, it's not variation. Like, it's not just the war stuff that's pushing it, okay? I mean, that would be a worry, right? Like, all the war stuff's false, and there's quite a bit of war stuff. So it might be that's just like a registered difference between his human interest war stories and these more kind of crime sniper stories. But it's not that. So we can see this, too, if we just disaggregate. Okay, so the approach we're taking is just sort of like a register analysis type approach, because we're really interested in seeing, like, is this what I see as a register difference, this difference in informing and deceiving people, or, if you want, making real informative news and just making fake news to get paid. Is there a difference in the language due to this difference in the communicative intent of the author? And to me, communicative intent, communicative purpose, this variation in the context in which the news is produced is a type of register variation. It's situational variation. And, what we've seen for decades is that those types of differences, create differences in the language structure. Like, there's a difference between a personal conversation and a lecture. There's a difference between a newspaper article and an academic article. These register differences are not arbitrary. They reflect the different communicative intents and purposes that are associated with those contexts. And so the hypothesis or the assumption going into this study is that we should potentially be able to find some difference here. It's reasonable to look for a difference across Blair's real and fake news because he had different communicative intent, okay? So to do this, what we do is we look at 49 grammatical features just from the sort of standard Biber set of features. It's a bit small because these articles are a bit short, so we exclude really infrequent features. And then what we do is we just go through and quantitatively compare each of these features individually. We find features that show substantial differences between real and fake news, and then we look at them. We do not do any multivariate statistics here because the corpus is so small. So we just do this by hand, basically. We look at the features, we look at the ones that show a difference, and then we try to come up with explanations that account for those differences, not in that, that link the difference in communicative intent to the difference in the structure of the language, okay? So it's sort of like a mini manual register analysis. Here's some of the differences, okay? So each of these dots is just one of the real and one of the fake, each dot's an article. These are just box plots showing various features. These are ordered by how strongly distinctive they are. So the single biggest difference out of these 49 features between the real and the fake news is that the real news uses longer words, okay? And so reading those charts, you can see the median line there in the middle of the box. So like, about 4.9 words on average length in characters, right? So words of, on average, about 4.9 characters in his real news, and then down at like 4.7 in his fake news. And you can see the distribution is quite different there, okay? It's a very minor difference, right? Imperceptible, I would think, to any of us reading it, but, still fairly robust, okay? Other nouns, so this is basically nouns, okay? So nouns are also more common in his real news, less common in his fake news. And nominalizations, words like nominalization, okay, are also more common. So a specific type of noun. All the nouns, gerunds, they're all more common in his real news, less common in his fake news. Those are the top 3 features. Here's the next 3, and they show the opposite pattern, okay? So emphatics, okay? Present tense, and predicative adjectives that like come after the copula, like he is happy. These are all more common in his fake news, okay? And if you know kind of Biber register analysis, you kind of are already recognizing this as a difference between more informationally dense texts, more texts that are more, kind of what you'd expect a newspaper article to look like. I mean, these all look like newspaper articles. You can't tell. His editors couldn't tell. Like, it's New York Times, right? The editors, professional editors, the best in the business looking, and they couldn't spot these differences. These are minor differences, but they're still fairly robust and consistent, okay? And so what we're already seeing here is this difference between things that are slightly more formal and slightly more informal. And when he's telling fake news, he's slightly more informal, slightly more conversational, slightly more informational when he's giving real news. Here's some others. They all follow the same. Well, there's another pattern I'll come to too, but these ones largely follow this pattern. Well, not suasives. I'll come back to that in a second. But pronoun it. So lots of pronouns. That's again more common in more common in spoken conversation. Again, these are all news articles, but there's a slight difference. The WH relatives is actually a tricky one. I don't think I won't talk about it in this talk, but it's actually a good one if you look in the book. Suasive verbs I will come back to in some detail, but they're more common in real news. And then a few more present participial, postnominals, copula be, other subordinators. So what I want to do then is go through general explanations for these sets of features and what they can tell us about the difference in style between his real news and his fake news, and what they can tell us then about why those differences in style exist, right? Because to me, just a bunch of random features that you find because you have enough data and you kind of go through and check everything and find some features eventually that do something. I mean, that's not really an explanation for anything. It's not really a style. The style needs to have, some kind of reason behind it, some kind of explanation that's functional. So here are the two. And I'm not going to go into tons of details on this. You can look at the book. It's all in lots of detail there. But on the one hand, what we found was that the point I've already made is that he had greater informational density in his real news. So more nouns, more noun modifiers, longer words. It's very clear. It's the most kind of common pattern in any register analysis. It usually pops up first. I mean, these are often in corpora that cover a lot more register variation. But even here we find it. And in my experience, it almost always doesn't really matter what you do. It's often the first kind of pattern. And then his fake news articles were written in a less carefully edited style, I think is the right way to put it. I mean, I think we're all writers, so we all do this, right? Like, and there's a saying about how, like, if I only had another hour, the letter would have been half the length or something, right? So what we all know, right, is when we're writing papers and anything with a length, anything where we're either really concerned with the style or where there's a length limit, and there's real length limits in newspaper articles, right? I mean, harder than in academic articles. What you do is you edit down your text, right? Through editing, you compress it. One of the ways you do that is by using fewer sentences and using longer sentences. You take things that were linked by pronouns over multiple sentences and you bring them into a single sentence by having long noun phrases that pack a lot of information in. This is something we all do. It's a fairly common pattern, and that's what Blair does. When he's saying real news, he's really packed the information in carefully. And when he has fake news, he hasn't. And the explanation for that is fairly straightforward, I think. The first is that he has no information, right? Like, he's not actually trying to convey information to you. He doesn't want to come up with more and more fake information. He's not trying to do this to, like, deceive you about a particular thing. In that case, you might be motivated to really pack it in too, right? But he's just trying to produce articles. He's just giving you lies for the sake of lies, right? And so the more you pack it in, the more lies you have to make, right? So you want it, as undense as possible. The other thing is that we know the reason he was doing it. It wasn't to try to, manipulate financial markets or something. It was to manipulate his own financial benefit by producing lots of articles. And so time was the thing that did this. And editing takes time, right? And so that's what we believe happened here. We believe because of the fact he didn't have any real information to express and because he was trying to move through as quickly as possible, that he then resulted in these less dense articles. The second one, and that's obviously very specific to this context, like I've been kind of giving you in passing counter examples, right? This one here might be more general, and that is he expressed, well, this is at least how he put it in the book, greater conviction in his real news. So he takes a more persuasive and confident stance. He starts talking about his beliefs more. He starts making predictions about future events more. He starts using quotations more. And so I think this all kind of points to just more conviction. Like he's more engaged with the ideas and about talking about their consequences and about backing them up. And this is showing more belief in what he's saying and like that this matters. Whereas in his fake news, they don't present this information with as much certainty. There's agentless passives. He's dropping the subject all over the place. He does funny things with his quotes. He's downtoning, okay? We don't think he does this on purpose at all. We think this is kind of like a tell. So, overall, we find this systematic variation, and we think that these differences can then, these differences in the context in which he's producing this news explain this variation. Like, it's not arbitrary variation. It is driven by the context and the motivations for writing, okay? Now, the big question is, like, how does that generalize? And, we're not directly generalizing here. We're trying to show, if anything, the opposite, right? Like, in this case, what we see is how these really specific motivations of one author for why they lie, and in the context in which they're lying, how that then drives these language differences. And we can find really systematic differences, and we can do this because it's such a controlled corpus, right? Very controlled. But, we don't expect that would necessarily go onto the next author. In particular, you can see how information density would be really different. You could see how some carefully constructed piece of fake news written to convince people of something would be the piece of news that took the longest time to edit, right? With the most care. Okay. So I'm trying to point out here some challenges with fake news study because I think this study of Jason Blair, like we're really proud of it, and we think it's like a really tight study. Like, it's just such a perfect case study. Like I said, it's kind of a natural experiment, right? It was just good luck I remembered it, honestly, and good luck nobody else had remembered it first, okay? There's not many of these examples. I don't know many others. There's one in German, I believe. There was someone from Der Spiegel who got caught a few years ago doing something like this. It's a pretty good one, I think. I'm not sure if you have the same kind of baseline that we had there, but there's the only other one I can think of. There might be a couple other, there's a couple of historical ones too. But it doesn't generalize, right? Like just by definition, it doesn't generalize. It's only looking at the language of one journalist. It's its strength. We know that like author variation doesn't cause this. We can explain it based on their personal circumstances, but obviously those personal circumstances will differ, okay? But the point I'm more kind of concerned about here is that it doesn't, like we do introduce a method for studying fake news. Like given a corpus, we just steal register analysis, right? There's a method there for doing it. But what we don't do is we don't give you a method for finding cases like this, right? And so it's just not scalable. Like we have no process for finding them. The fact that someone remembers the case isn't really a process, right? And so that's difficult, and it's difficult to figure out authorial intent. Okay, so that's why research in linguistics, and especially in natural language processing, works off fact-check data, okay? Because that is, in principle, scalable. It's not quite as easy as it sounds if you do it with any kind of care, but it's easier than, hoping to find cases where people have admitted lying, okay? And so the idea here is that you go and you use a fact-checking service, you trust them, and you get their fake news and their real news, and then you compare it, okay? Now, a thing we point out in the book, and then I'm going to come back and kind of slightly argue against here, I would not really argue against it, but kind of extend the argument or complicate it a bit, is that in my mind, like without variation in communicative intent, or without some variation in the context in which real news and fake news is produced, and where everything else is kind of kept stable, it's really unclear to me why falsehood would create a difference in someone's style. If you know it's false, I get it, right? Then you have this, you know it, and that might be reflected. But for example, I don't think we would expect that like corrections, articles that have been corrected would show a style difference from articles that haven't been corrected generally. And you could do this, right? Like this is a study I don't think anyone's done, but it's easy to do. You go and find some authors' articles that have had corrections issued on them, all the ones that haven't, and see if you can find language differences. And my prediction would be that you don't, right? Like an honest mistake is an honest mistake. I don't know why if I interview two people and the one guy lies to me and I believe him and the second guy tells me the truth and I believe him, that difference, at least outside of the quotations, I suppose, would make a difference in the language structure. And that's, I think, the kind of underlying assumption, at least, well, one of the underlying assumptions under fact-checking. But it might not be. It's not always, but that's one. And I think the assumption is often taken in natural language processing. I think the other assumption is something like this, and I think this is fairly reasonable, that falsehoods in the news tend to be evidence of deception, okay? Maybe especially falsehoods that don't have immediate corrections attached to them, Okay? And I think that's a fair assumption, but it's obviously not quite as controlled, and there's lots of other things happening there. There's a bigger problem, right? So the bigger problem, I think that problem is sort of theoretical and it can be worked around, like I'll show you in a second. But the bigger problem is that, like, these NLP studies especially do not control for register variation. So although they're effectively looking at register variation, they don't control for these much stronger sources of register variation. Look, I could give you blogs and newspaper articles written in any language, and you can sort them in seconds, right? Like, it's easy. You just look at them. They look different, right? It's much harder to sort based on real and fake news. These are all register differences. They're all differences in the genre and in the communicative context, and some of them are much stronger, right? So the difference between a blog, there's major differences between blogs and newspaper articles. Now, if your corpus of fake news is all blogs and your corpus of real news is all newspaper articles, there might be a real and fake difference there, but good luck seeing it, right? Like, you're just going to see the differences between blogs and news, and especially if you've never thought about that there are differences between blog and news and don't really think of register variation, you maybe don't even see that. And there's a lot of that in the fake news research, where things that are classifying based on genre, broad genre, like online, unedited, unprofessional, quick blogs, and like some of the most carefully edited stuff in the world, and you find differences, you say it's the difference between truth and lies, and it's not, right? It's the difference between newspapers and blogs. There's also dialect problems too, right? Like, the average New York Times author is highly educated, right? Probably went to Ivy League University, probably have editors from Ivy League universities, and then, you have your blog author who, maybe never went to university at all, right? So there's all these differences that go uncontrolled. And the beauty of the Blair study is that these are all naturally controlled because it's one author, one newspaper, one set of editors. It's really nice that way. Okay, so I think in the book we give a pretty negative view of fact-checking, but there's not that many studies, and like I said, you can do fake news and look at it from all sorts of different directions, and students want to do fake news, and so this is what Bashir did. Bashir built a corpus up of fact-check data, and despite that prediction, finds some really clear differences, so that's what I want to circle around to now. Okay, so this is supervised by Matteo and I. She just defended her dissertation, really strong dissertation, has all these different studies. So there's a news values paper that's coming out in Discourse and Society. There's a move analysis paper. And what I want to focus in on is a full multidimensional analysis. So this is a lot more data. So, it has a factor analysis that was run from scratch. But this is fact-check data, okay? It's true and false data based on various fact-checking. It was done very carefully. But it does some other things here to try to get around the problem of, this imbalance, register imbalance, and then crucially, it tries to explain the results. So in NLP, often the explanation is there is none, right? It's just the accuracy results, right? But not here. We try to explain it, and when you try to explain it, you then come to a better understanding of what's going on. You get to validate the results and make sure they make sense, and you're not just sort of, misclassifying on some other information. But it's a very different type of corpus, but it's very similar methods in principle, so it's a nice comparison as well. So this is the corpus. It consists of 137 false news articles, and they were collected based on 5 different fact-checking websites. Many of these are things like blogs and things like that. The true news corpus contains 548 true news articles. Now, this is the first kind of step that Bashir did, and this is actually like before my even involvement in the project. I was off at the time when Matteo started supervising it, so it's something that Bashir came up with. And the idea is one way to control for register variation is like to include register variation in your true news, right? So then you can start to see, well, how is the true news varying between broadsheets, tabloids, blogs, and online news sources, right? So the true news already has register variation in it, and one that starts to drive the patterns of variation you find in the larger corpus, including the fake news, but it also gives you a bit of a touchstone and lets you see to what extent is this register variation really makes the fake news different than all these different types of real news, not just the type of real news you happen to pick, okay? So I thought it was a really clever thing. The other thing is it's balanced across topics as well. So these are texts on, there's equal balance of COVID, general vaccination, and climate change. And these are obviously topics where, there's a lot of allegations of fake news. I should have said this, like the first study, it was tagged using Andrea Nini's MAT tagger. He was a student of mine. He's now up at Manchester. It's a nice tool that will do multidimensional analysis for you. And then Bashir did all of the analysis in R. Okay, so there's 3 dimensions. Once again, the first dimension is the same as before. Okay, it's this involved versus informational using Doug's terminology, but you'll see, you might have a hard time seeing it, but the features that are, well, maybe it's easiest to see these features: average word length, total nouns, nominalizations, right? It's the same as, just exactly the same, right? Of course, this one's found mechanically, whereas we found ours by hand, and when we found ours by hand, it's very much informed by the many, many mechanical analyses that came before. But that is the first pattern. But notably what you see, if you look at false news, right, so we're using the term false news here too, it's not marked at all. It's kind of in the middle. You see lots of variation within the real news categories, which Bashir explains in the dissertation. But the false news is not marked here. It's not going to be a distinctive feature here, as opposed to the Jason Blair, right, where it clearly was. Okay. The next one, again, a really common dimension that often pops up, is how, like, narrative the texts are. So for narratives, you have like lots of past tense verbs, you have lots of third-person pronouns, you have lots of public verbs. These are words like say, said. Again, these are really canonical, well-attested patterns across many corpora. They're really easy to interpret. But crucially, again, the fake news is like remarkably unmarked, right? Just in the middle, okay? And then here's the one where we find a difference. Okay, so this is now false news against the others. This is not a well-established, as far as I know, dimension. It was interpreted here as being related to overt advocation. Or you might say about the expression of opinion, is what I'll come back to in a second. It's harder to analyze, it's harder to interpret because there's not like a long tradition of these set of features. But the things that are associated with what Bashir called overtly advocating for certain views were infinitives, which are often used to mark opinions, conditional adverbial subordinators, same thing, necessity modals, like you must do this, predictive modals like will, which does have some overlap, and suasive verbs. And then on the other hand, not that many features on the other end. And here, false news uses less of these overt advocation markers, or what you might call, I might kind of reinterpret here a bit as opinion markers. Okay, so here's the main finding, in my mind, slightly different than maybe how Bashir presented it, but broadly in line, but sort of being used here in a way that fits with the rest of this talk, and I think my preferred interpretation here, and that is that dimension 3 is the only one where false news is marked, and in this case, we find that true news is more overtly opinionated than false news. So the false news contains fewer of these things that are associated with the expression of opinions. So things like suasive verbs, recommend, suggest, infinitives, which are often used in practice to mark opinions in news. Prediction modals like will and would, talking about things that might happen in the future. Possibility modals like should and must. So all these words that are associated with their stance markers, I'll come back to that idea, opinion markers, more common in the real news. The fake news is less marked for this. Now, I say this is somewhat surprising, right? Because, the fake news is presumably more opinion, if you like, right? I think it's important to note here that, we don't really know, right? But, looking at the data, I don't think anyone's trying to purposely lie to anyone in the fake news, in the false news. I think it's false, right? Or it's been fact-checked as false, right? But I don't think these people are, actively trying to deceive you. I think if there's someone in there saying that vaccines don't work, I think that's what they believe, right? I don't think I don't think it's like someone who's shorting vaccine stocks. It's someone who believes that vaccines, a lot of people who sincerely believe that, right? People who believe climate change isn't happening. They're not climate change scientists. They're not purposely deceiving you. They just believe that it's a lie, right? They believe this truly. And so I don't think deception's happening here. It's something a little bit different. Okay, so then how do we explain that result, right? How do we explain that given that this false news is focused on advocating for fringe opinions, whereas the real news is more often grounded in fact, how do we get that result? And then how do we reconcile this with our idea that, if there's no difference in the intent to deceive or tell the truth, and I don't think there really is here, then how would that lead to variation in language use? So this is the hypothesis we came up with, and this is what I mean. We kind of can extend that two-way classification system almost into a cube now, right? Because there's another thing that's happening in news, and that is, are you supporting or challenging mainstream beliefs? Now, I think this is something that authors know exactly when they're doing this, right? And I think there's a basic difference between mainstream news and fringe news in this sense. Mainstream news is establishing the mainstream narrative. If you work for the New York Times, you work for the Washington Post, the Guardian, or the Telegraph, you are because you work for those newspapers, actively establishing and reinforcing the mainstream news narrative. That's what it is, right? Like that's your job. And if you work for a fringe, alt-right, alt-left blog, your job is, like what you're doing, the way you see yourself, is you're challenging mainstream narratives. Well, that then becomes a difference in communicative intent. It's not a difference around intent to deceive, intent to tell the truth. Everyone thinks they're telling the truth. It's not a difference in the actual veracity of the data being presented. The COVID data is particularly notable in this case, right? Like, there was a lot of news about how we were going to stop COVID by washing our hands, right? A lot of news about how all the vaccines were equally good. People don't, that cloth face masks would do the trick, right? Like, this is all stuff that was in the mainstream news, and this is stuff that's in the fake news, in the false news corpus, fact-checked false, right? Like, fact-checked false that the AstraZeneca vaccine is just as good as the Pfizer one, but we don't give the AstraZeneca one in England anymore, right? It's not generally considered true anymore, or false anymore, but it was considered false then and got fact-checked. The underlying factuality of the information is difficult to establish, and it's dynamic over time, the opinion of whether it is factual. And we don't know right now if we're right about these things, right? I don't know. We could all, die in 5 years from some vaccine, spin out or something. I don't know. Right? These are possible. Okay? So I think that's crucially what's happening here. The mainstream supports or establishes the mainstream narrative. The data that gets fact-checked is true. The data that fact-checked is false argues against it. So why does this happen? Like, what is the motivation? Like, why do we get this in particular? Like, given that explanation, then why does this lead to the linguistic difference of the authors of the false news marking fewer things as opinion? It's because they're guarding against this, right? Like, if you see yourself as someone who's challenging the mainstream view, then you want to use language that makes it harder to challenge you. You want to downplay things that are opinion. You want to mark things being more confident. And that furthers your communicative goal, right? Like, your news will be doubted by people because it's challenging the news that's already out there, right? And so you're trying to guard against it stylistically. You're trying to rhetorically take this rhetorical strategy of presenting this as being pretty certain, right? You're going to downplay the use of these opinion markers. On the other hand, if you write for mainstream news, you don't have that concern. You're establishing the mainstream news. Like, you are at the top of the news chain, and now you can mark some things as opinion and some things as fact, right? Like, that's fine. You don't lose anything by doing that. In fact, you gain something by being clear about when you're stating an opinion and when you're stating a fact. It's more informative. You're not going to lose control of the story by doing that. In fact, you do the opposite. So again, I think we see how these superficial, and they are superficial, right? Like average word length and noun use. I mean, they're not like deep features, but how they reflect these deeper explanations, and they come back to differences in communicative intent. And without that difference in communicative intent, or some difference in the communicative context in which this language is produced, I don't think you should expect to find differences. Okay, no, I think I've said all this. Okay, so I think the other thing this study helps us do, though, is understand what's really happening with fact-checking. I think it's really important to get this point, and it's not one that was clear to us until we did the study, right? Until we started thinking about Bashire's data, how we could explain it, this idea about challenging the mainstream or supporting the mainstream, right? Creating the mainstream. And I think what this does is, at least for me, really clarifies what fact-checking is doing. And I think the important point here is that fact-checkers do not evaluate veracity. They can't do it, right? They just don't have the time. In this room right now, in this summer school, we just have a whole summer school essentially about understanding the truth about some very, very specific things that are often less societally important than this. There's a long history of work in this area, and we don't presuppose we know all the truth here, right? A fact checker is someone who just goes, all they do is they check the mainstream narrative. That's what they do. They check against existing news articles from trusted news sources. They check against, if you're lucky, against scientific records, academic records, government records, things like that. But fact checkers are not scientists. They're not police officers. They're not government researchers, right? They're none of these things. They're not journalists. They don't go in and do further investigative journalism, right? Like what the New York Times did to Jason Blair was a different type of fact-checking. They went and like phoned people. They went and like went to San Antonio and met the family. Like that's fact-checking. That's like real fact-checking. What a fact-checker is doing is checking against the mainstream narrative. And so I think this fact-check data, you know, insofar as other sources of register variation are controlled or brought into the study like Bashir did, is totally good. It's really telling you something about real and fake news. But we shouldn't kid ourselves and think that it's like finding veracity differences. It certainly isn't that, I don't think. Or is it finding like differences in intent to deceive and tell the truth? Like I said, I don't think people who write blog after blog about how vaccines are, you know, a conspiracy don't believe that. I think they really do believe it, right? And so I think that's what fact-checking is doing. It's checking against the mainstream. And then these differences make sense, right? Or, I mean, I think at least they potentially make sense. Like differences found in these corpora between the style of fact-checked true and fact-checked false different news are real, and they're explainable, but they're not explainable in terms of veracity. They're explainable, I think, more often in terms of, in this case, mainstream and challenging the mainstream. Now, I don't want to say there's nothing else to it, because we kind of said that in the book, and then here's this study showing us that it's, you know, there's more to it than that. But, you know, I do think that in this case, that's probably what's happening with fact-checking. It's really the perceived current acceptability that what fact-checkers are checking against, because they would also check different over time, right? Okay. So I think really what we have here then is what we see is that, you know, a lot of this is related to stance, right? And we could say, you know, both of these studies, both of them, you know, which seem very different. I mean, they're different data, types of data, very different scope in terms of like how much variation is represented there. They do use similar methods, but we can see they share some features, right? So suasive verbs, infinitives, prediction modals all pop up in both studies. And so I think the way we explain this, well, here's the two patterns, right? So in Blair's real news, in his real news, they take a more persuasive and confident stance, more suasive verbs, infinitives, prediction modals. In his deception news, you know, less certainty, less detail. The explanation is something like Blair knows he's fabricating news, and so he inadvertently expresses his lack of conviction by using fewer of these stance markers. In other words, Blair is less likely to overtly express opinions in his fake news because he does not really have opinions about his lies, and because he doesn't want to attract scrutiny to his lies, right? On the other hand, in Bashir's false news data, the true news tend to mark the expression of opinion more overtly using these stance markers, okay, because in their case, it's valuable to show what's opinion. You know, the ability to express opinion in a news article is a real like privilege, right, which comes from working for really powerful newspapers. False news doesn't. They're trying to challenge the mainstream. They know people are going to doubt what they're saying top to bottom, and so they avoid the expression of opinion. Both of marking things as opinion and just the expression of opinion full stop. I mean, I don't really know the difference. Like, we don't really track that down here. That's hard to do, right? But either way, that's what's being avoided. So I think there's a basic difference in stance, which is, you know, basically how a person expresses their assessments, attitudes, opinions towards the information that they're communicating. And I think, you know,